When you think about like a massive corporate empire or a legacy family business failing, you usually picture this really slow, quiet decline.
Oh, yeah. Like a gradual fade into obscurity.
Exactly. Just a few bad quarters. Maybe they miss a major market trend. A competitor quietly eats up their market share. And then, there's a hushed bankruptcy proceeding behind closed doors.
Right. The money dries up, the influence wanes, and society just kind of moves on to the next big thing. I mean, it is rarely front page news by the time the actual doors close.
But then you look at what is arguably the ultimate family business, which is the absolute monarchy of France, and their failure wasn't quiet at all. It wasn't gradual.
Not even a little bit.
When you dig into the historical analyses from places like thecollectorandstudy.com, alongside the foundational overviews we're using from World History Edu and Wikipedia, you realize this wasn't just a simple bankruptcy. It was a spectacular, bloody, highly public explosion.
It's basically the absolute definition of a catastrophic systemic collapse. I mean, when the entire business model of a nation relies on one single person being, ordained by the divine to rule over everyone else, a failure of management tends to involve a guillotine in a public square.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark severance package.
Definitely.
So we are looking at the House of Bourbon today in this deep dive. And to really understand how a family ends up on a scaffold in 1793, you have to understand how they managed to seize the most powerful seat in Europe out of sheer chaos, right?
Yeah.
How they manufactured this deeply pervasive illusion of legitimacy, and crucially, what structural traps they set for themselves along the way. Because before you can lose a throne, you have to win it.
And their path to the throne is just a masterclass in playing the longest possible game.
Which is fascinating. And just to set the stage for you listening, we're bringing two different lenses to this today. I'm going to be focusing on the political, financial, and institutional maneuvers of the Bourbons.
And I'll be looking at them through the lens of family dynamics, their cultural legacy, and the really potent symbolism they use to maintain their rule. Because to trace the Bourbon roots, we actually have to go all the way back to 1272.
Wait, 1272?
Yeah, 1272. That is when Robert, the Count of Clermont, he was the youngest son of King Louis XIX, he married Beatrix of Bourbon, who was the heiress to a significant lordship.
Okay, but marrying into a royal family as a youngest son, that doesn't put you next in line.
Yeah.
It essentially makes your descendants the historical equivalent of, like, a spare tire in the trunk of a car, right? You are what they call a cadet branch.
That is the perfect way to look at a cadet branch, yeah. They had royal blood, sure, but for centuries they were simply high-ranking nobles.
Just waiting in the wings.
Exactly. They served the direct Capetian kings, and then later the Valois kings. They fought in the wars, they managed their regional estates, but they were absolutely not the main event. There were several branches away from the actual crown.
Right, until the late 16th century. Specifically the year 1589, when the main engine of the French monarchy completely stalls out.
It was a mess.
A total mess. France is facing this massive political vacuum because the Valois line of kings dies out in the male line. And at the same time, the country is being torn apart by the War of the Three Henries.
Which is just a brutal, grinding civil war.
Yeah, and deeply tied to the Protestant Catholic religious conflicts that were basically tearing all of Europe apart at the time.
And this is exactly where that spare tire finally gets called up. Henri of Navarre, who is a Bourbon, suddenly finds himself as the legitimate heir to the throne. But, and this is key, it is entirely due to something called Salic law.
Right, let's unpack Salic law for a second, because it is the actual mechanical reason the Bourbons get their shot. Salic law was this ancient Frankish tradition that explicitly forbade the inheritance of the throne through a woman.
Yep, no queens allowed to rule in their own right.
Exactly. A female could not rule France, and a male could not claim the throne through his mother's lineage.
It was a rule designed centuries earlier, mostly to prevent foreign kings from marrying French princesses and suddenly claiming the whole French kingdom.
Which makes sense strategically.
It does. But in 1589, it meant genealogists had to trace the lineage all the way back up the family tree, past closer female relatives of the dead king, and travel literally 300 years back down that cadet branch to find the closest living male relative.
Which is just wild to think about. And that guy was Henri of Navarre.
Right, so he has the legal right on paper.
But he hits a massive, seemingly insurmountable political roadblock. Henri of Navarre is a Calvinist Protestant.
Right, a huge problem.
Huge. He's the military leader of the Huguenots, which was the term for French Protestants. But the immensely powerful Catholic League essentially controls the country, including the capital, Paris.
And they have the backing of foreign powers like Spain, too.
Exactly, and they flat out refuse to recognize a Protestant monarch.
So he is facing a total stalemate. I mean, he has the legal right to sit on the throne, but he cannot physically enter his own capital without being killed. The Catholic League would rather tear the country apart than let a Huguenot wear the crown.
Imagine a new CEO buys out a legacy company in a hostile takeover.
Okay.
The paperwork is signed, right? He owns the building. But the entire board of directors and all the senior management barricade the front doors because they absolutely despise his management style.
Oh, that's a great way to picture it.
Right. He realizes very quickly that he can't just fire everyone and run the massive company all by himself.
Huh.
The only way he is going to survive, step into the building and actually run the business, is if he completely adopts the existing company culture.
Henry IV makes that exact calculation. He looks at the decades of religious bloodshed, he looks at the reality of his military position, and he makes a deeply, deeply pragmatic choice.
He pivots.
He does.
Mm.
In 1593, he formally abjures his Protestant faith and converts to Catholicism.
He famously, supposedly said, Paris is well worth a mass, which is just pure political calculation.
Complete.
He realizes he can't take the capital by artillery fire, so he takes it by going to a Catholic church.
And this establishes a defining foundational characteristic of the early Bourbons. They did not gain power by divine right descending from the clouds, nor did they conquer the country through overwhelming, undisputed military supremacy.
Right.
They gained the throne through shrewd, calculated compromise.
And he cements that compromise a few years later, in 1598, by issuing the Edict of Nantes. So he is now operating as a Catholic king, obviously, but the edict grants a significant measure of religious tolerance, civil rights, and political freedom to the Protestant Huguenots.
He essentially forces the two sides to just tolerate each other. I mean, it restores order and ends the devastating religious wars. It's a masterstroke of statecraft that finally stabilizes the country.
But, pragmatism and compromise, they get the Bourbons the throne. But when you're trying to build a dynasty that will last for centuries, you can't just be viewed as a good compromising politician.
No, not at all.
You need a mystique. You need the public and the nobility to believe you are untouchable.
Exactly. To maintain their legitimacy, the Bourbons had to fundamentally alter the cultural understanding of what it meant to be a king. They couldn't just be the family that won the Civil War. They had to build this aura of absolute, unquestionable authority.
Right, and from an institutional standpoint, the heavy lifting for that transformation is done by Henri's successor, Louis XIII, and his incredibly ruthless chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu.
Oh, Richelieu. He was brilliant.
He really was. They look at the traditional power structure of France and realize it is way too decentralized.
Right, so they set their sights on the traditional nobility, the families known as the nobles of the sword.
The old guard.
The old guard, exactly. These were the ancient aristocratic warrior families. For centuries, their power came from their own lands, their own wealth, and crucially, their own private armies.
They were essentially independent warlords who lived out in the provinces and only occasionally, tipped their hats to the monarch in Paris. If a king enacted a policy they didn't like, they actually had the military capability to rebel.
And Richelieu systematically begins dismantling that regional power.
How does he do it?
Well, he starts replacing these aristocratic warlords in regional government positions with a new class of people called the nobles of the robe.
Ah, okay. The bureaucrats.
Exactly. The administrators, the judges, the tax collectors, men who often bought their positions, but whose status, wealth, and authority came directly from serving the state.
Right, so their primary loyalty was to the crown, not to some centuries-old family lineage or a regional stronghold.
Right.
By shifting the administration of the country away from the old aristocracy and handing it to these administrative professionals, Louis XIII pulls all the levers of power toward the center.
He makes the state machinery rely entirely on the king.
So the infrastructure of absolute power is built. And that perfectly sets the stage for the man who would take that centralized machine and wrap it in the most potent cultural symbolism Europe had ever seen.
Louis XIV.
The Sun King.
We're talking about a monarch who ruled for 72 years.
Which is just staggering.
It's a staggering length of time to shape a nation's psychology. He didn't just operate a government, he manufactured a reality. And the ultimate physical manifestation of that reality was the Palace of Versailles.
Now, when you look at pictures of Versailles today, The Hall of Mirrors, the endless gold leaf, the manicured gardens stretching literally to the horizon. The modern instinct is to see it as this unimaginably expensive vanity project.
Right, looks like a king with an unlimited budget just showing off to the rest of Europe.
Was it just a vanity project, though, or was it a calculated political prison?
Oh, it was absolutely a symbolic cage. It was an architectural marvel, sure, but its true genius was psychological warfare.
Oh,
Well, think about those nobles of the sword we just talked about. Those dangerous independent aristocrats with their own armies. Louis XIV couldn't just execute all of them to secure his power.
that would spark another civil war.
Exactly. So he forces them to leave their power bases in the provinces and come live with him.
Wait, he mandated they live there?
He mandates their presence. And once he had the most powerful men in France isolated in this massive palace, he trapped them in a web of excruciatingly trivial court rituals.
Wow.
He manufactured an environment where the most important thing in a duke's life was no longer how many soldiers he commanded back home, but whether he got the honor of holding the king's candle when the king went to bed.
Or who had the privilege of handing the king his shirt in the morning.
Yes.
He literally turned potential military rebels into courtiers fighting over the chance to help him get dressed.
It's brilliant. By forcing them to participate in this dazzling, highly choreographed theatrical performance of absolute power, he stripped them of their actual, tangible power.
That is wild.
They weren't out in the provinces raising armies or conspiring against the crown. They were trapped in Versailles, spending their fortunes on expensive clothing just to keep up with the court, desperately trying to catch the king's eye.
He took the medieval reality of governance, which was, messy, decentralized, and highly prone to rebellion, and replaced it with a highly visible performance where all light, all favor, and all power radiated directly from him.
Hence, the Sun King. The cultural messaging was that the king was not just a political leader, he was the physical embodiment of France itself. His daily routine dictated the heartbeat of the nation.
Right. L'état c'est moi. I am the state.
Exactly.
But, and here's the institutional trap, building an entire governmental apparatus around one man's physical presence and supreme charisma creates a massive existential vulnerability.
Oh, definitely.
When you build a system that requires superhuman performance at its center 24 hours a day, the entire production collapses when the next performer forgets their lines.
And the Bourbons ran into exactly that problem with his successor, Louis XV. Because he inherited this massive theatrical apparatus of power, but he entirely lacked the drive, the energy, and frankly, the sheer willpower of his great-grandfather.
Yeah, where Louis XIV was the sun radiating energy outward, Louis V was kind of apathetic. He was notoriously secretive.
Very much so.
He hated the public rituals. He just didn't want to perform the exhausting role of the absolute monarch.
And when the king refuses to actively manage the factions at court and refuses to assert his presence over the nobles of the robe, a massive power vacuum opens up right in the center of the state.
And someone is always going to fill that void.
Always.
In the case of Louis XV, it was often his official mistresses, most notably Madame de Pompadour.
Right.
Now, she was brilliant, but she gained this unprecedented, totally unelected influence over the court. She controlled who got access to the king, she influenced foreign policy, and she directed state appointments.
Which was a massive problem for their image. I mean, the French public might accept absolute power when they believe it comes directly from an anointed king ordained by God. But they deeply resent it when they see the levers of state being pulled by an unaccountable favorite behind closed doors. It severely eroded the cultural prestige of the crown.
It cheapened the whole thing.
Exactly. The aura of the divine monarch was decaying into pretty petty factionalism, gossip, and scandal.
So the cultural magic is wearing off precisely at the moment the bank accounts are draining.
Oh, the money. Yeah.
Because the Bourbons under Louis XIV and Louis XIV were engaged in near continuous, incredibly expensive global warfare. We were talking about massive conflicts like the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763 and resulted in France losing the bulk of its North American colonial possessions to Britain.
And funding a global war while simultaneously maintaining the unimaginable luxury of Versailles requires a staggering amount of capital.
It left the French treasury essentially running on fumes. And here's the fatal institutional trap the Bourbons built for themselves. When Louis XIV mooted the nobility at Versailles, part of the unspoken compromise was that the nobility retained certain ancient privileges.
Right.
And the most devastating of those privileges was an exemption from the primary direct taxes of the realm.
It's just insane to think about today. The wealthiest landowners in the country, the people holding the vast majority of the nation's capital, were legally shielded from paying the taxes required to keep the nation afloat.
It's structurally bankrupt. So by the time Louis XVI takes the throne in 1774, he inherits a broken system. The debt from the wars, including, their support of the American Revolution, is crushing.
Beyond crushing.
But the absolutist system is now completely incapable of reforming itself, because every time the king's finance ministers attempt to modernize the tax code and force the nobility to pay their fair share, the nobles use the parlements, the high courts, to block the reforms.
Yeah, they argue that taxing them violates the fundamental laws of the kingdom.
The king is theoretically absolute, but he is trapped by the very privileges his ancestors granted to pacify the aristocracy.
Which brings the timeline right to 1789, the eve of the French Revolution.
Because the nobility refuses to pay and the state cannot secure any more loans, the French government quite literally runs out of money. Louis VI's back is against the wall, forcing him to do something a French king hadn't done in 150 years. He calls the Estates General.
Right, and for those who might not know, the Estates General was this medieval representative assembly divided into three groups. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the nobility, and the third estate was everyone else, the commoners, who made up about 98% of the population.
But the mechanics of how this body voted were incredibly skewed. Traditionally, each estate voted as a bloc, so the clergy and the nobility could always combine their two votes to outvote the commoners 2-1.
Ensuring no reforms would ever pass that threatened their wealth.
Exactly. Calling this assembly was a desperate, last-ditch effort to solve a balance sheet problem. And honestly, I'd argue that the violent end of the monarchy was purely a failure of financial mechanics.
You think so?
Yeah. If they had just modernized the tax code 50 years earlier, the treasury would have been stabilized, the bread shortages wouldn't have triggered riots, and the revolution could have been avoided.
I mean, I get why you look at the balance sheets, but honestly, I have to respectfully disagree. I think the empty treasury was just the final symptom of a much deeper terminal illness.
Wait, you don't think the debt triggered the fall?
I think the debt was the spark, but the room was already filled with gas.
Okay, what was the gas?
A real death blow wasn't financial. It was the total collapse of their manufactured cultural aura. Over the course of the 18th century, the Enlightenment completely reshaped how the public thought about power.
The philosophers.
Right. Thinkers like Rousseau and Voltaire were distributing ideas about natural rights, the social contract, and the idea that a government legitimacy comes from the consent of the governed, not from divine right.
So the intellectual foundation of absolute monarchy was basically being dismantled in the coffee houses and salons of Paris.
Exactly. And as those ideas permeated the culture, the absolute divine mystique of Versailles stopped looking like a brilliant display of power and started looking like a deeply absurd, tyrannical relic. The Bourbons had built a system that was rigidly dependent on the illusion of total supremacy.
They basically trapped themselves in their own brand.
Precisely. To compromise was to break the illusion. The moment Louis XVI admitted he was out of money and needed the Estates General to help him raise taxes, he was publicly admitting he was not an all-powerful, absolute monarch.
He shattered the mirror.
He really did. Once the aura of invincibility was gone, the Third Estate realized they didn't have to play by the rigged voting rules anymore. They broke away, declared themselves the National Assembly, and the revolution was practically unstoppable.
So the rigidity of the institution simply couldn't survive the evolution of the culture.
Yep.
Because they couldn't bend, they snapped. And that snap led directly to Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette facing the guillotine in 1793. The ultimate violent end to the French absolute monarchy.
It is truly one of the most dramatic falls from grace in human history.
It is. But the story actually has a fascinating global epilogue. Because the guillotine claimed the king, but it did not wipe out the entire House of Bourbon.
No.
A family that failed so spectacularly in Paris actually managed to survive on the global stage.
And to understand how they survived, we have to look back briefly to the early 18th century, to a massive geopolitical conflict known as the War of the Spanish Succession.
Right.
Because in the year 1700, the Habsburg King of Spain, Charles II, died without leaving a direct heir.
And in his final will, he names the grandson of the French king, Louis XIV, as his successor. So this young prince, the Duke of Anjou, travels to Madrid to become King Philip V of Spain.
And you can imagine the sheer geopolitical dread this caused in places like London and Vienna.
Oh, total panic.
The prospect of the French military machine and the immense wealth of the Spanish colonial empire uniting under a single Bourbon mega-empire, it terrified the rest of Europe.
So it triggered a devastating global war that dragged on for over a decade. Britain, Austria, and their allies fought fiercely just to stop the Bourbons from controlling both thrones.
And the conflict was finally resolved by the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. The treaty allowed the Bourbon Philip V to keep the Spanish throne, but under an ironclad, non-negotiable condition.
Which was?
He had to permanently renounce any claim to the French throne. The crowns of France and Spain could never under any circumstances be united.
So the family essentially diversified their portfolio. They branched out and secured a second headquarters in Madrid.
And that geographic diversification is the reason Bourbons are still relevant to the modern world today.
Right, because King Philippe VI, the current reigning monarch of Spain, is a direct descendant of the House of Bourbon.
Yep.
And the Grand Duke of Luxembourg is also a member of the Bourbon family through a cadet branch.
They survived into the 21st century by learning the exact lesson their French cousins ignored. Exactly. The modern Bourbons outside of France adapted to their cultural surroundings. They embraced constitutional reality. They accepted that survival meant sharing power with elected parliaments and operating within the bounds of a constitution rather than clinging to the rigidity of absolute rule.
They secured their future by finally accepting the very compromises that Louis XVI was structurally incapable of making in 1789.
They traded the illusion of absolute power for the reality of long-term survival.
Which is incredible. So we set out today to unpack the central tension of the House of Bourbon. We started with Henry IV, a man who secured the throne through gritty political pragmatism, literally changing his religion simply to survive a brutal civil war.
We then saw how his descendants transitioned from pragmatic survivors into absolute illusionists. They built a psychological cage at Versailles, centralizing all power, wealth, and status on the physical person of the king.
But the institutional and symbolic rigidity that made the Sun King so untouchable ultimately triggered the dynasty's demise. They built a magnificent administrative machine that fundamentally could not adapt. It couldn't force its richest citizens to pay taxes, and it couldn't withstand the intellectual awakening of the Enlightenment.
Which leaves us with a truly fascinating historical what if for you to ponder long after you finish listening today.
Let's hear it.
Consider the massive amounts of resentment the glittering isolation of Versailles generated among the starving population of Paris. If Louis XIV had never built that palace, if he had allowed political power to remain somewhat decentralized and messy, rather than creating a singular opulent focal point for the entire nation's anger, would the French Revolution have ever happened?
That's a huge question.
Did the Bourbons' greatest architectural masterpiece, the very building meant to project their immortality, actually guarantee their own execution?
It really seems like the ultimate family business failed because the leadership started believing their own marketing just a little too much. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the House of Bourbon. We hope it gave you a new lens on history, and we encourage you to keep exploring these complexities on your own. There is always more beneath the surface.